Greetings, folks. Welcome to our Wednesday night Tavern chat. It's where the finest minds in gaming discuss a topic, or at least the people who tune into my channel. Who are the finest minds in gaming, of course. Hope everyone's doing well. Got a couple things up and going here. There's Wolfie. How's it going? So, for anyone tuning in now or later, I'm doing all right. Do my usual speech, watching from the tomes on Twitch TV from the tomes. If you're watching this on Twitch, you know where it is. You might want to drop over to Fox and Board Games on YouTube, and you just search that, and then you can check out not only the archives of these videos, but some content that'll be coming shortly, hopefully. That'll be YouTube exclusive. foxandboardgames.com. Twitter and Facebook at Fox and Board Games. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, drop over to Twitch so you can join in on our exciting conversations, such as this one, and watch me work on my game and game material. Please like, subscribe, follow, and support. I appreciate it. So tonight's a fairly big topic. This is the sort of thing that we will probably revisit, and we'll probably some old school art there for everyone out there who will know what that's from. And I'm going to start off with that in a discussion of the nature of religion in RPGs first. But that's what the topic is. It's a fascinating topic. It's really fascinating. And I've actually been doing work on that. I don't know if you tuned in during the week or not. I can't remember. But I've been working on that during the week. And it just gets really big really quickly. Let's see. Pete, here he is. What are you talking about, PJ? Right there, PJ. I was actually going to get this before I started to talk, and it slipped my mind. All right, here we go. Getting about as old school as it gets here. Deities and Demigods, first edition. Hey, how's it going there? Good to see you. Well, anyway, yeah, it was brought up. I actually was going to have this ready before it's been kind of a long day, so I had some discordant moments throughout the day. But anyway, yeah, here's the Deities and Demigods, and this was my first introduction to. Let's see, where are they? The Cthulhu mythos. Chinese myths, Cthulhu mythos. The book that got TSR in trouble in more ways than one. Cthulhu Mythos, and then of course we had the Melnibonéan mythology. Some more Lovecraft. My earliest impressions of Lovecraft. Hail Eris, hail Discordia. Yeah, I've been deep into I've been pretty deep into stuff. Here's the Melnibonéan mythologies, which I again this is also my first exposure to Elric. There's a cat up there antagonizing a dog, so that's what you're hearing. Yeah, there was some really weird stuff in here. Really weird stuff. Very cool. I'll be curious to hear what you're working on. I'll share a little bit with what I'm working on. So I actually do some differentiation between cosmology in the sense of the actual geographic and celestial makeup versus religion and mythology. I do in my work. I differentiate it slightly. Not that I think it's right or wrong to do it either way, but I tend to put religion even separate for cosmology because it's just such a big thing. Um, Man, is it big? I just spent as most of you know, and I talked a little bit about last week. Last week was a meager week. This week's been a lot more active here on Twitch land. Um, but I spent 2 weeks in Germany, and I spent time in three eras of human civilization. I spent time among the Roman ruins of Trier, the remnants of the Limes Wall, which was like Hadrian's Wall. It went through Germany, separating Germany from the barbarians. Um, and then I went to the medieval castles and cathedrals, which is this whole other era of religion. And then monoculture faiths. We are going to talk about that tonight. This is going to be a hot night, and like I said, this will probably be more than one. Um, this is going to probably be more than one chat, I think, because it is so big. And then I spent time among some Celtic burial sites, and so you're dealing with the Celtic, of course, overlapped with the Roman, which overlapped with the Middle Ages, and you're dealing with this. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is like the discussion on races and culture. I'll be going back over all those again too, because I know there are people who didn't get to some of those that had a lot of really great ideas. And as I said, this isn't about me just sitting here and talking about my work, which it partially is, but it is as much about me hearing what other people have to say. So yeah, the deities and demigods with Cthulhu, Melniboné, mythos. My first exposure to both those authors, H.P. Lovecraft and Michael Moorcock, and I was like, "What is all this weird stuff in this book?" I guess I was 12 or 13 when I got it, and then I went and was like, "Wow, this is some cool." And then I became a Lovecraft addict and a Moorcock addict. It sounded kind of strange saying it like that. A Melnibonéan, an Elric addict. So I definitely was turned on to that all through D&D and all through TSR. I mean, I already knew about the Greek myths. From a very young child, I was reading Greek mythology. Roman, of course, a little bit after that, and Egyptian stuff I was into just because it was cool Egyptian stuff. But the deities and demigods not only turned me on to the. Did they have Fafard and the Grey Mouser stuff in that book too? Lankmar. I don't know if they had the Lankmar stuff in here. Oh, so it also turned me on to what has become one of my absolute favorite mythologies, the Finnish mythology. Yeah, Nuon. The mythology Nuon. They do have it. So, they had the Nuon mythos, which was another giant copyright violation on the part of TSR in the good old days. The bad old days when nobody cared. Thank you. Oh, hello, McNancy. Thanks for subscribing. I'm really thrilled. Eternal Champion Addict. Yeah. Man, I got in so much trouble when The Witcher first came out. Because when I heard it was called The White Wolf, I'm like, it's just a ripoff of Elric. And then, of course, everybody pointed me to all these articles where the guy who designed The Witcher and wrote the novels out and out said this was an homage to the Eternal Champion. And I was like, okay, all right, that's cool. He's into it, and I'm into it. So um, I thank you very much for the subscription there. But yeah, this introduced me to all these great novels, but also like Finnish mythology, which I was like, wow, it's like North mythology, only way cooler in some ways. Of course, being a person who has been identified with Norse paganism at one time or another in my life, putting it mildly, it's I'm saying that kind of sarcastically too, because we all know that Norse paganism has become horrendously diluted and saturated with unsavory elements and all these other things. Without That's one of the reasons why I don't actually actively associate with it these days, not in any kind of organized fashion at any rate. Um, and even they talk a little bit about the Celtic myths here. So, well, yeah, exactly. I went back and I went and learned about, well, that's right. Every form of modern religion, including neo-paganism, is so far from its roots, and we can't. And this is part of tonight's topic too. Um, Non-Scandinavian, no, and the Finns are not Scandinavians, and that's the interesting part, and that's this whole other. And I know Finns, I know Finns, and I've had conversations with Finns about this, and it's really then talk to the Sami. Talk to the Sami, who are the indigenous people of those lands, who are treated as poorly by the Scandinavians as we treat the Native Americans. Um, it's such a crazy, and tying this all back into mythology and folklore and religion. This just gets so big and so complicated, and so yeah. So again, this book was so fundamental. That's why it's the backdrop for today. It was so fundamental in, yeah, the other natives. Exactly, the other. Right. Continental Africans. They had a thriving culture. They had a culture as rich as the Europeans until the Europeans found them. That's just history. That's nothing but history. Um, this book not only introduced me to the world of these fictional mythologies like Lovecraft and Melna Benea, but they also introduced me to many other world mythologies that I wasn't very aware of, and Chinese mythology as well. I mean, I really, because they have a little bit of Native American in here too, which is, again, all of this now, of course, 40 years later, is a little cringe, because it is written through a fantasy gaming lens. It is written through this very like suburban middle American lens, which that's who the writers were. Then it was, yeah, it was cringy. Yeah, it's cringy. I mean, a lot of it's kind of cringy now. This many layers. So that's a really great question. So I was, just from my own background, I was raised by Italian American immigrants, but I'm not Catholic, and I never was. I was baptized Methodist for a bunch of political family reasons I won't get into here. But I mean, I was completely surrounded by Catholicism and Catholic imagery 24/7. But I never identified with any of it. But I identified with all of it. Like, people have asked me what I believe from various religions, and I'm like, well, all of it and none of it. Like I think they're all touching on some other fundament. I think most world religions touch on some fundamental truth about the way people perceive the universe, even if it's not how the universe really is. Um, I mean, obviously, I knew the Chinese, the Japanese, the the Native American, etc. I considered all of those real, in as much as I considered those cultures real. It's when I got to the Cthulhu mythos, I'm going, what is this? But then I kind of thought, well, that's kind of real too, right? And then more I read the Cthulhu mythos and the whole mythology, the Necronomicon and all this stuff, it's not, obviously, yes, I know it's not real. Um, yeah, so Arthurian legends. I mean, I kind of, at the age that I read this, didn't really differentiate between a Grail Knight legend and a Catholic saint story. To me, they were basically the same thing, in their own way. Obviously, when I read the intro that said that, Leon, the City of Lankmar, Fritz Lieber is an author, fantasy author, I was like, oh, cool, I'm going to go read his stuff. When I read about H.P. Lovecraft and Moorcock, I'm like, I'm going to go read their bizarre, demented worlds and mythologies, and I got really into them. So I guess I considered at least anything rooted in a real world culture, even at a young age, as real as everything else. And I kind of still do in a cultural context. Again, I mean, if you ask me what I am today, the answer is so rabbit hole and so twisted. I mean, again, a lot of people identify me as a neo pagan or a specifically Scandinavian, Northern European pagan. Um, and yeah, Conan. And but even that, my views on it are radically different than what most people picture when they picture people who are into those things. I would say philosophically, I'm closest to Taoism in a lot of ways. I would say that I'm probably mostly an animist. So, in a way, I'm naturally also atheistic in that I believe gods are expressions of these other things. So, for me, what's real and what isn't real is this really strange gray area. And I've dealt with a lot of people who do vision questing, both in an indigenous and a non-indigenous context. By non-indigenous, let's say the core shamanistic, modern contextualization of all of that, which I have severe issues with. When some people do it, other people I think handle it very respectfully. I've always said like I never thought a bunch of people chewing on mushrooms in their living room are necessarily equivalent to shaman, and that's gotten me in trouble more than once because I don't believe it. I believe shamans serve a very specific cultural role in their world. Oh, that was my yeah, that was my that's my takeaway. But that's how I kind of view all this. I mean, I also do, and as I say in my, I put it in one of my posts earlier. Um, so and this Wolfie, that's a whole other discussion. So this is the real funny part. Like I'm writing this fictional religion, right? Let's jump to that. Let's jump to this in a gaming context. The philosophy of what's real and what's not. That's kind of how my whole mind works. I come from a visual arts and performing arts background and a writing background, but I've spent a huge amount of time in comparative religion, modern folklorists, mythology, paranormal, all that kind of weird stuff. So I tend to think of things as real and not real in a very different way than what a lot of people do. And most people who meet me day to day are like, hey, he's this really grounded, like, kind of normal. He's weird. He's an artist, but he's, got these really like kind of grounded philosophies and all that. And then sometimes I'll open up my mouth and start talking about fairies or something. And then they realize like I'm not really kidding. And again, like I'm not talking about fairies like little Victorian people with wings. I'm talking about the folkloric beings that inhabit trees, that inhabit water, that inhabit rocks, that inhabit your house, that are not what we think of when we think of Tinkerbell and these other kind of pop culture version of fairies. So then they're like, wow, this guy's really out there. But I'm not really that out there. I'm not really out there except maybe perhaps in the modern West. The East and the South still have very strong beliefs. Right. They all right, exactly. The impact on reality is where I consider these things real or not. And I spoke to someone about this. So she has spent a lot of time singing and she's not Christian at all. Um, Now she's very devoted to her familial Jewish faith, but she spent a lot of time in pagan circles. She spent a lot of time in Catholic settings doing professional singing. And she kind of took, at one point she said, what you have to realize is all these things all these places I've been in, the one thing I've noticed is that faith puts like grooves in reality, you know? And that was a great way of putting it. Faith and belief puts grooves in reality. So I think that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about spiritualism, mysticism, that you're introducing these concepts, these intangible concepts, and making them real. And if they have an impact on people's lives, they're real, right? If they have an impact on how people think, if they have an impact on how people vote, for better or for worse, right? In your personal opinion, then they are in fact real. They are real. But back to the whole conversation that I think it was Wolf or PJ said, that this all looks great until you realize that it's. Can I move this above that? Can I move this above that? I guess my image just overtakes everything. I have to drop my Deities and Demigods. Sorry. Oh, the document's not open. That's why. Okay, boom. There we go. Sorry. Shrink that down. So I'm here working on this document for my RPG about religion. I had very loose ideas of the religion of each culture. Okay. I decided to start in Magrelin because Magrelin and the Rubari people who inhabit it are the oldest people still surviving intact culturally on the continent. And their religion has transformed, but it has not ever completely faded. Now, one of the great transformation period was the rise of the Blazu Razed with the Shining Order, which is effectively an ascetic monastic cult. And I'm writing this, and they start out as these monks who, are into elementalism. And no, it's not based on The Last Airbender, though they're obviously that. After I wrote it, I'm like, well, this is kind of Last Airbender-ish, even though I've never watched a full episode of Last Airbender. I game with people and are friends with people who have binged it and are obsessed with it. And the casts all align to a different element. And I'm talking about the Blazu Razed and their motives and their rise is from this ascetic cult about discipline to this socio-political movement. I was like, oh my God, religion in my world is just as awful as it turns out often in the real world as soon as it becomes state institutionalized, right? And it's funny because it was this very subconscious thing on my part that as I'm writing through this, I get to the end, I'm like, wow, I just created, the blueprint that, yeah, sure, feel free, spit it out there. Again, I sit here and I talk about my world on my daytime chats like 8 hours a week. If you have something that you want to share, please share it, because this is an opportunity that I think is great for you. Now, I know that everyone who's chatted tonight, I don't see who else is lurking. Hello to everybody who's lurking. Thanks for coming. I know that Peach and Wolfie and a few of the other people who are probably here but may not have chatted yet are very thoughtful about these larger picture things in RPGs. But while you're getting that typed up, the Rubari culture, they have this Shining Order that took over, but they left a lot of the institutionalized gods and goddesses intact because they realized that you cannot stop people from worshiping something, so they incorporated it into their elementalist teachings, and they have now become a background political movement and political control system based in the caste system. So they're not even as much about religion now. They're about this kind of cabal, this kind of cultic order that controls the institutions in the city. Whereas the religions, I would say, are probably closest in flavor to some of the Greco-Roman, but the evolution of them is probably closer to Hindu religion, in the way that it intersects with society. And the fact that this culture is rooted in a maybe it's actually closer to, let's say, Akkadian religion. Hinduism just comes up because of the caste system, but those two are not necessarily. I did a lot of reading on the caste systems in India for this too, and of course they're not like they don't function quite like they think we do. They do, but they don't. So I started to think about all these things that we just talked about in the first half hour of this chat. Like, what's important to these people? What's the history of these people? Where do these gods, goddesses, and beings come from? And, obviously they're a culture that's near a giant lake and a river system and sandwiched on this peninsula between water on 2.5 to 3 sides. So one of their primary gods is a water god. It would be Hasamal here. So all the language is Indo-European in root, with a leaning towards pre-Christian Bulgarian. So this is okay. So this is interesting counterbalance, because I was just going to say the one thing about this world, particularly this region of the world that I'm working on, it is not traditional fantasy. It is not the microculture and extended religion of, say, D&D, All right, so let's see. Let's see what we got here. Let me scroll up a little bit. Fantasy Medieval World, not claiming original. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Go surreal. I like that. We have this standing joke that when a player character dies in our game, I don't know if anyone here actually played old school Ultima Online, where the character, you could follow people around as a ghost and talk to them, but all they saw was ooh, ooh, oh, 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 oh. So the joke is, like in any of our RPGs, as soon as anyone dies, we just start, if it's online, we start doing the ghost thing. But that kind of reminds me of this. All right. Okay, so it's very much, so the aspect has the astrological notions to it. Now I don't know, it is the aspect based in any kind of astronomy or astrological structure, or is it something that is comes from another facet of the world, a spirit, a celestial sphere? There's one religion. So what is that? Is the one religion a parallel inherited part astrological? So is the religion that's real, is that a monotheistic religion? Is it rooted in any kind of personified god, or is it something else? I do like the ghost part though. That's pretty funny. Okay, so it's Christianity like. Okay. So I guess you could also equate it to like Warhammer, like the Sigmarite religion. It's like a cross between Jesus and Thor, which is, I find absolutely hilarious, which is the only game I'll play a religious fanatic in, just because it's like wow, this is so over the top. I mean, I think it, so if your world is a medieval world, pseudo medieval with the fantasy and the steampunk elements, Imperator Vault, yeah. I think it works. I mean, this is part of the discussion I have with people, and I've had it on this chat, and I've had it on my other daytime chats. So in this world, it's distinctly rooted, this particular culture. And no, this is only one of six prominent cultures. So all the religions are going to be different, right? Yeah, I mean, if it's an outlined religious dogma, and if it's real in that world, then go for it. This society is really rooted in a polytheistic early city state post agrarian culture. So naturally, all the gods and goddesses are going to reflect that. They're going to reflect aspects of that. But when I run an actual medieval game, such as Ars Magica or Vampire Dark Ages, I make no bones about it that in that world, it's real. The Holy Roman Empire and their beliefs are real. Let's see. And you say you might want to play Risk of Fanatic and Warhammer as if you have any other choice. Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, okay, that's yeah, Warhammer Fantasy. I mean, that was the whole joke. Our group is composed of myself, who is a warrior priest, who's a meathead and a religious fanatic, and a witch hunter who's also a crazy religious fanatic, and then a knight, and then a guard who basically is hiding a noble birth who's just kind of stuck with us, so it's like these lunatics who are roaming the countryside, obsessed with chaos and obsessed with demonic infestation, looking for it where it even isn't, like even when there's absolutely no sign of it, we find it somehow. But that's, yeah, exactly, that's kind of the joke of that world, and I do love playing that in that world. But yeah, like when I run Vampire Dark Ages and someone's playing a vampire and is like, "Oh no, my character's not a Catholic. They don't believe that." I'm like, "Yeah, they do. Well, where are you from? Unless maybe you're from a remnant tribe still in the depths of an Eastern European forest. If you're saying your character's Italian but they don't believe in the church, I mean, maybe as a vampire they've had other things revealed to them, but God's still real. Jesus is still real. The Virgin Mother's still real. In this world, they're as real as the ground. They're as real as the sky. And that's something that a lot of modern players, and I talked about this when I ran the Old West game. And I said, okay, how many characters are going to church this Sunday? Oh, no, I'm not going to church. I'm like, yeah, you are. Like, you would. Like very few of the characters in that game would have not chosen to go to church or felt obligated to go to church. So religion in those games becomes this really kind of, yeah, yeah, you really are going to church, and I think it's really hard for us in this modern era to understand that to the people in Magrelin, Saloon, the sun god slash goddess, because it's a dualistic deity for the two seasons, because there's really only two seasons in this world. Or Ranu, I mean, Ranu is a newer god, so they are the god of money, trade, and silver. So that we could say is yeah, is going to church a fate to black moment in RPGs. Yeah, it could be, especially for vampires. Um, or Shao Shaka, the goddess of the hearth and fertility. These beings are as real in this world as the player characters, if for no other reason, because that many people believe they're real and they have impacts on the world and on society. And we live in a very privileged and convenient time to be able to step back and just say, nah, none of that's real. I'm making up my own thing. I'm following my own road. This is very much a product of the modern times. And I'm not saying it's wrong, because obviously I'm a modern human who just said they are more or less agnostic slash borderline atheistic in a sense. Not atheistic in that I don't believe in anything, but atheistic in that this idea that to me, gods and goddesses are extensions of something else, personifications of something else. I'm definitely not monotheistic. I've never believed that, oh yeah, there's just one thing out there that's right, and it's right and you're wrong. So yeah, you were talking a little bit about your game, PJ. But yeah, no, Freed, I think that's cool. I mean, I think if that is, I think for your setting that fits. And like I said, when I run Ars Magica or some other historically based game, I'm like, no, this is a world in which the church is real. The power of God is real. You're a vampire. It will burn you. If you it'll burn you if you mess with it. Um, One of my early storytellers, Esslinger, in fact, PJ introduced several Arabic jinn killers and they were vampire, and they got turned on to vampires, and that was this whole other bag of problems because their methods were so different than the Christian witch hunters we had encountered. They just walked in and the fist of Allah struck us and we took like levels of aggravated damage. It was like not even subtle. They were just like, yeah, we're here to kick Jin ass and drink tea, and we're all out of tea. So let's see. Cynical actual character in a party of zealots. One cleric. It's the common theme. They kept saying, if I don't believe in God, and I just look at them and like they're crazy. Of course I believe the gods are literally right over there, shooting the breeze and having a beer. Why I don't share it? Yeah. Why I don't believe that is that they care, or you can understand what. So yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting and a really dicey thing, McNancy. Like, faith is a very Abrahamic concept, right? Like, let's see. And that's a big part of it too. And I've always, I was really thrilled with Robert E. Howard's portrayal of, Crom and the gods of Hyperborea. They just don't care. I mean, they're kind of Lovecraftian in that sense too. They're not like great old ones. They're not, malicious alien entities, or maybe they are, because there was some crossover there. But Crom just didn't care. Yeah, he was real. He just didn't care. Didn't care if you were, if you were a believer or not. And I mean, that's an interesting counterbalance, PJ, because it's like, yeah, I'm not religious because I can't imagine that these beings really care about what we do as humans. Yeah, in Stygia, they're definitely malicious, uncaring. They're basically the elder gods in Stygia in another form. And I think that even was made clear at some point in one of the letters between Conan, or between Conan and Lovecraft. Yeah, well, kind of between Howard and Lovecraft, and that he had taken this idea of the elder gods, and the Stygian worshippers were somewhere between like the Cretan snake cults and a worshiper of Yig. To one of these fantasy settings there becomes faith. So yeah, that's a really interesting point, especially how we use faith today, in that it is a blind, or at least a willing acceptance of something that objectively may or may not be real. Faith and faithful used in RPG books, yeah. Armor of faith. If it, yeah, why it's called armor of faith? It actually works. That's great. That's a really good point. We should change it to something else. And I think that's something that I have thought a lot about, especially when it comes to D&D and that related territory of fantasy games and RPGs, is that they still are essentially written from a modern Judeo-Christian concept, modern Judeo-Christian lens. They're still through that. They're looked at through that lens. They're played through that lens. I mean, it's kind of hard because the vast bulk of the writers, the vast bulk of the players come from that background. So it's not a fault, and I'm not judging anybody. Well, I think faith is, yeah. I think faith in a horror RPG, and I think it works especially well in the world of darkness. This concept of true faith. So that's interesting. And that's something I'll probably get to in another chat on this particular topic. That not every one of my cultures in this game world has gods and goddesses. In fact, I'm going to argue that at least half of them don't. Actually, maybe two-thirds of them do not. There are the Frore, who are your, if you want to say barbarians, they're animists. Maybe they worship animal spirits. So maybe they have this idea that these animal spirits are godlike, but then they also kill these animals and carry around totems of them, like a lot of historical tribal cultures did. The Meluk are believe in they're essentially vegetationists. They believe that when they die, their spirits go into the plants of the plains that they were born from. You know, and do they believe in some kind of higher controlling agency or entity? Maybe, but not in the way that, let's say, the Rubari or the Hapshar. Now, the Hapshar they're the Melnibonéans, but in cultural presentation and even in appearance, they're somewhat Melnibonéan. But then they also have a lot of Greco-Roman cultural influence in their worlds. So their gods are very Greco-Roman. Their gods are, Diana and Pan and Zeus like, and all these other kind of figures we're sort of familiar with because that was the sourcing of that culture that I used, was a remnant Greco-Roman, the remnants of an empire, the tail end of the Kavassan Empire. So ancestor worship, yeah, Roman inspired hobgoblin old empire of brass, yeah, right, right. Well, and this goes back to a really big discussion, and even though I've said bluntly that obviously in these worlds that when I run a game that's monotheistic, the monotheistic God is real. And if we were all living in the Middle Ages right now, we would not even openly be having this conversation. We would not. We would not risk whatever penalty of heresy could come out of even having this conversation. Or if we lived in modern day Iran, right? That's largely political. Of course, it was in the Middle Ages too. That there were always people who challenged, established notions. So again, I don't think every person living in our historic Middle Ages or in our historic ancient India or in our historic, Native American cultures blindly believed that all of this was completely real. But I think you're going to find that the vast bulk of people, even if they questioned things, did not necessarily explore or vocalize it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that was interesting too, because as I talked about in my one chat earlier in the week, not only this concept of these various religions, but I've introduced this caste system, which most modern Western players have a really hard time kind of wrapping their mind around. And I admit, even as a writer who has really looked into this and studied this and talked to people who come from casted cultures and read accounts of, caste, how the caste system works, it's really hard to wrap your mind around it, especially when you're down at a role playing game. Of course, yeah, Martin Luther or John, yeah, exactly, right. And even if they didn't question the church or the faith, they questioned the political and socio-political motives of the institution, which, by the way, I think is ubiquitous. I think everybody in every culture, even Buddhism. I remember even Buddha, an account of Buddha questioning the rise of Buddhism when he saw a giant gold statue of a Buddha. It was like, it was one of the Buddhas, when he saw a giant gold statue of a Buddha saying, guys, I'm Buddha and I'm saying this is kind of not right. This isn't what we had in mind. So I think that is absolutely, cool as far as a fantasy world. I think it's silly. And I think even in your case where there's a monotheistic culture, yeah, I mean, obviously, especially if you have scientists. Yeah, I should actually. I've heard of Hessus Siddhartha, but I have not read it. Well, right. And that in some ways is the modern humanist atheist approach, that yeah, okay, whatever's here or not after or not here afterwards, the reality is we should not be in plain English shitty while we're here, no matter that we can create our own reality here. We have the, at least most of us probably on this chat have the economic and autonomy, economic facility and autonomy to, in a sense, create our own reality to one degree or another. I mean, yeah, all of us have to go to work or do something like that, you know. Yeah, right, exactly. And that's one thing you. So PJ said about the monoculture of fantasy worlds earlier, and the mono religions of. And I've always found it interesting that D&D in particular takes this kind of essentially medieval world, which by all accounts would be, could be, if it's going to be at all historical, which we know D&D, especially at this stage, is not historical, is would be ruled by a single institution, a single monotheistic institution. And then they throw in this peppering of all these kind of mostly Greco-Roman or maybe Northern European based gods and goddesses for characters to worship and draw power from. And I find that really interesting. And I understand that in its original form D&D was, I'm just trying to find the words. It was modeled it was modeled off of this kind of menagerie of aspects, you know, this kind of menagerie of our own medieval era, but let's make it interesting and have these gods and goddesses and demons and beings walking around. But at the same time, it never actually really made a whole lot of sense to me. And in fact, the very first D&D campaign I ran, yeah, and that's the other thing. I think, well, and so that's the other thing. When it comes to alignment in gods and goddesses, at least in D&D, we're to assume that it's all real, right? And I think it was Third Ed even really went out of their way to stress that, like this is not an intellectual abstraction. Good, evil, law, chaos are real forces, and there are beings representing it. You know, um, well, and so that's the thing. That's the interesting thing when I was sitting in Trier and reading about the Gauls and the interactions between the Gauls and the Romans. Like a lot of the Gauls were like, "So you mean I just have to change the name of this god to that god, and I can keep doing what I'm doing?" And the Romans were like, "Yeah, pay us taxes." And the Gauls were like, "Yeah, sure, okay," And they kind of went about their way. Descent of seafaring cheese thieves. My ancestors' audacity. Their acts of cultural appropriation. So it's, yeah. And that was the weird thing about the Romans. Even, I mean, the Greeks had this kind of pure thing that originated from their culture, their aspects of god and goddesses that were in sense extensions of themselves. And then the Romans were like, "Oh, hey Gauls, hey how hey Celts, hey whatever other culture they happen to come across. Sure, Bretons, hey, let's come on, join us, and we can just do whatever." And that's what they succeeded for only did exactly. Keep doing what you're doing. Just pay the damn taxes. That's exactly it. So I kind of took that approach with this idea of this ascetic cult that takes over this ancient city, approximately 1,500 years in the history, that kind of said, well, as long as we still have the fundamental moral control over the city, you can keep your giant temples to your death goddess and your giant temples to your sun god, giant temple to your sun god, and all these other things. But we're actually the ones who are right, and you just have to, you have to deal with us. So I think that's a really interesting thought when we start talking about our own world and how things were definitely not as black and white. Let's talk about Scandinavia, right? We now know, and I do know scholars who are in Scandinavia and study this. We now know that this idea that, oh, everybody worshipped Odin and Thor in ancient Scandinavia, we know it's just not true. We know those gods were actually very late in the Scandinavian proto-Viking into the Viking era. And we know that house spirits, land spirits, and ancestor altars were not unknown, or at least they think that they were ancestral altars. That these, and that the Vanir, the Freyr, the Frey, that they were all essentially either ancestral tier, they were all ancestral gods or goddesses, or else animist expressions that were then later put after contact with the Romans, that they were put into this much more strongly personified form. So again, we have this define late to the faith. So it's kind of late to the faith. Interesting. I mean, if we're talking about what I was saying about the Scandinavians, I was thinking later in the age and development of the culture that these faiths appeared and became personified in the way we think of them today. Yeah. So yeah, no, I was thinking like, so they're fairly confident that it wasn't until later on that bridge between the agrarian and the seafaring raiding period of the Vikings, probably after contact with the Romans, let's say 800 BC. I didn't. You can double check me on the numbers because I don't have a book here in front of me to qualify it. That some of these gods and goddesses existed. There's like 1,000. Oh yeah, it's still 1,000 years. Absolutely, it still is 1,000 years. And oh, I'm sorry, 800 900 AD. 800 900 AD. I didn't mean BC. I mean 800 900 AD. That these beings became personified in the way that we know them. And that we think of them as they were commonly worshipped this way throughout the entirety of Scandinavian culture. Whereas we think much earlier, they probably had different expressions. And while there are certain artifacts, like statues that we assume are going to be Odin and that we assume are going to be Thor and Freyr, that go back a really long time, they were not as solidly and consistently worshipped, at least in the same way. And I find that really, really interesting. That in the modern lens, we have this idea of this culture that had been homogenous for these thousands of years and worshiped these gods and goddesses and then took them all over the world when they went raiding. The fact is that their day-to-day faith might have been very different, especially in places that weren't. So, and that was actually, yes, the northern Germanic tribes had analogs, at least of Tyr, probably Thor. They had a being they called Wotan, and these all now they're thinking might have actually been some sort of tribal ancestor or tribal founders at one point or another that became elevated to this godhood. So that also has and this is something that I have discussed with people who know a lot more about this than I do. Okay, so at what point did that all get to Scandinavia? And was it a product of the Indo-European migrations that we only saw it expressed later when the Scandinavians started coming back down to the mainland? That we realized they had also inherited this kind of religious DNA from the Indo-European tribes? Because, yeah, they were common in the Germanic tribes. And there are some really interesting parallels between the Indian or Indo-European, how the Indo-European gods and goddesses, yeah, how the Indo-European and later Indian gods and goddesses really seem parallel to a lot of what we see in Northern Europe. So again, my suspicion has always been there was some sort of root migration that occurred. I am not an academic anthropologist, so that's just my suspicion from reading a lot. I think they did share them at the same time. I think they did share them at the same time. Okay. Interesting. Interesting question. Yep. Just really quick, back to Freed, I think they did share them at the same time, and I think the roots were all there. And I think how they formed according to geography, how they have formed according to the culture that was impacted by geography, depended on the expressions. For example, there's descriptions of Wotan being a harvest and a grain god, which if we're gonna assume he has the same religious DNA as Odin, Odin in the north, where there was very little harvest and agriculture in that sense as there would have been in northern Germany, he took on a different form. Again, at least from what I've read and kind of interpreted. The setting I'm reading? So that's an interesting question. I would say, let's say in this region, in Magraland, the Maghreb Peninsula, the home of the Rubari, all the gods and goddesses are more or less shades of gray. There are definitely ones that are darker, but they're not necessarily evil. There are, however, nether spirits, the equivalent of demons. Now, there's not the fall mythology. Like, there's no correlation between, oh, they were great and now they're cursed. They are simply beings that exist somewhere else that are not benevolent, and they have their own motives, and they can be dangerous to deal with. And then there are the Karkaron, which is the extra dimensional, demonic, alien force that came to this world 1,000 years before the game starts and then was pushed back. So even though it's now all a hot topic, this was, in my mind, picture them being kind of Cenobite-ish. Is kind of where I was going with that, is that they are this kind of, and not modern, not with all the, S&M paraphernalia, at least not in modern context, but they are these other kind of entity that came from somewhere else. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for stopping in. It was great to see you. Hopefully I'll see you again. Like I said, I'm going to start doing some more varying times, and hopefully they'll accommodate your time. Great conversation. It's great hearing about your game, too. I'll be curious to see more about what you come up with. Eldritch beings. Yeah, Eldritch beings is probably the closest description. Now, some of the nether beings kind of conform to Eldritch beings, too, but the Karkaron are a race. They are a race of self-aware, self-serving race of more or less alien beings that showed up through a situation. Insert magical disaster / intentional summoning / and again, I have this all written down, but so I have a lot of duelist gods in mind as well, like Kema, the death, the underworld goddess who has elements of Kali. She has elements of hell. She has elements of some of the aspects of the Morrigan, but she is also beneficial because she guides souls to the afterlife. But she can also exhale plague at will. So it's kind of like that. Is she a demoness? Is she a goddess? I got in trouble once because I was talking about some of this in an art setting, art context, and something that somebody was creating one of my art classes. And they started talking about demons. And the person who was doing this is a, tried and true, young pagan, and she's, interesting character. And she's talking about gods and demons, and I make this comment, well, demons are just the gods we used to worship. And apparently one of my students was extremely religious, and I heard about it later. And they got, only once. The school I teach at is very open-minded. It's very eclectic. But apparently this kid was just really upset by that comment. And I didn't get in trouble, but I did hear about it, that the student had told other people in the department that I had made this comment. And of course, none of my other faculty members care, but it was interesting. But that's kind of the approach I'm taking with this world. So I can't give out any spoilers, but I can't give any spoilers because it might have a direct impact on one of the scenarios I'm working on. There are definitely beings let's call them lower deities or lower beings, lower spirits, that they were all once gods, right? That that are sometimes contacted, that are sometimes brought into existence or communicated with, that definitely don't have the morals that humans ascribe to gods and goddesses or worship them. And they are generally considered something identified as malevolent. They're the equivalent, they're the lower beings, the equivalent of what we would call demons. Are they devils? Is it a case of good or evil? Well, I mean, they don't think they're evil, right? They're just doing what they're doing. They're these malicious beings who they're serving their own purpose. They just don't care about humans. Um, but then there is, yeah, well, right, everyone hearing their own narrative. Then there is this whole other category of these things that appeared that I could say, yes, is most likely equivalent to some sort of elder being, some sort of, you know, as I said, in my mind, they were definitely a little more Hellraiser-ish. They were a little more horror focused, but different society mores, exactly. And I mean, we even see that. So, you know, if we want to get deep into, well, yeah, and the two-faced gods actually make sense because let's just say that these beings are extensions of those who worship them or created by those who worship them, and they're going to have those concepts. They're going to be both good and evil in various ways. You know, I think I think that's something that was evident, that was clearly evident in our own world mythologies. Odin's a bastard. Odin's not a nice guy. You know, I mean, he's worshipped, you know, among the bro crowd as the champion warrior god who's, you know, he you know, he could bench press a bus, you know, or whatever. I mean, that's more Thor. But anyway, but when you really read the accounts of Odin from some of the sagas, I'm like, he's kind of a creepy bastard, you know? He's not necessarily a super nice guy. He thinks he's fine. It's his reality, his will to behave in the way he does. He doesn't consider himself evil, you know, but he's neither good nor evil. And I think honestly that is more evident if you were to examine these cultures in their historical concept than in the neo pagan concept, or the modern recreation of them, where we are looking at them through this Christian lens. That you are, in a sense, transposing your Christian ethos that you were brought up with. And again, I'm not busting anybody. Your Christian ethos that you were brought up with onto these ancient beings. I mean, let's look at somebody like Kali or any of the Durga personifications in Hinduism. Really scary, but also the only person who could break the cycle of karma by stepping outside of time, and who is also seen as a mother figure. So talk about really dualist and double-edged sword. I mean, this is a being who will literally cut your head off and drink your blood, but she's also your best friend. You know, if she's your friend, she's your best friend. Well, exactly. Um, you know, I think there's a lot of good modern renditions. I think Gaiman's American Dogs, yeah, American Dogs, yeah, we have that too. American Gods is a fantastic, the book more than the TV show. The TV show was up to a point was good, but I think that really captures it. That if these gods appeared today and started walking around and interacting as a reflection of us, like they would have reacted and interacted as a reflection of ancient people, you know, I think our impressions of them would be very different. And even somebody like Ostara, Easter isn't all bright and cheery and, you know, pretty colored flowers and bunnies. You know, it's like when you get down to it, she's actually a pretty dark figure. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I'll confess, I'm not talking about modern Irish or English or British Isles folklore, or Scottish folklore, but actual Celtic beliefs I don't know as much about it as I feel I should, but what I do know of it, some of those gods and heroes were pretty rough. They were not benevolent. They were not somebody that you flippantly invoked. They were not somebody that you just assumed is always going to be on your side. So I find that really interesting too. Or if you look at the Old Testament God, our own Old Testament God was not Jesus. He's not a very forgiving being. He's not a very kind being in a lot of ways. So I think it's totally in line to have a double-edged or a multifaceted deity. Let's see if I get any hate mail off this stream. I don't think so. Well, exactly. And I think that's where some of these writers of the pulp era of the late 1800s through the 40s, especially when they started addressing some of these pagan gods, especially under the guise of science fiction or fantasy, that they weren't necessarily saying these beings were evil, but the best you could hope for was that they didn't pay attention to you. And I think that was a pretty common belief or aspect in a lot of early societies and how they treated divinity. That either you had to make these massive appellations to do significant changes in reality, or you just hoped everything was left alone. And you hoped that you did not attract any undue attention. Well, let's look at fairy lore from the British Isles and from continental Europe. The absolute worst thing you want to do is attract the attention of the fairies. That's the absolute thing you don't want to do. Yeah, they were not. Again, their thought processes and their motives were so alien to mortals. Even if you felt like they were doing something good for you, you had to be very careful that you weren't going to offend them, sometimes by thanking them the wrong way or attract too much attention to yourself. So I think that's kind of where I also tend to go with how I view. Now, again, this world, right? This culture that I'm working on, the Rubari, they're very Babylonian. The whole thing is very Near Eastern Babylonian. Pre monotheistic Babylonian. So they have this whole array of gods and goddesses that do different things. But at the same time, then at some point I'll talk a little bit about some of the animist cultures and some of the totemic cultures that are about. Then there's another cult. There are the Varinka, who are basically the Whateleys, who live in this old abandoned city. That's this whole culture that lives in this old abandoned city that something is in communication with them. We can just let your minds, all of you who know how I think and know what I'm into and are into the same stuff, just let your mind wander. And you'll probably get to the same end result, that there's something quite disturbing going on there. So that's that little bit of eldritch horror there too. That there's this whole city in the south where they're kind of my Stygians, in the way the rest of the world treats them, but what they are in touch with is not even in this realm of classical gods and goddesses. But what I find interesting, though, is talking about this, Lovecraft based a lot of his tales, or at least the imagery of his tales, off Greek myths, particularly Greek and earlier myths, particularly sea gods and goddesses, and kind of the more inhuman and horrific aspects. So there's a case that we tend to think he just kind of made all this up on his own. First of all, he read The King in Yellow, which predates any of the Lovecraft stuff by 30 years. So, and he was also reading all this mythology and drawing from mythology to create these kind of really twisted fantasy creatures. I think that's what I got for tonight. It was a really good talk. Had some really interesting conversations. Anyone else got anything they want to throw out? Again, greetings and thanks to everybody who's tuned in, especially those who've just been lurking. I appreciate it. I liked hearing about Freed and PJ's worlds. Like I said, half why I do this is so people have a place to throw ideas around too. Coming up on the 8:15. That's when I find most people start. Have a good one, Wolfie. All right, friends. I think this will conclude Tavern Chat for tonight. Very enjoyable. Thanks a lot. So design talks generally Mondays 2 to 4, Tuesdays I think I'm going to start going towards a noon to 2 range, and then on Thursdays generally like 11 to 1, maybe it'll go to noon. Sometimes Fridays I pop on too. So I'm back from my various travels for now, and I'm going to be spending a lot more time writing. I'll probably be spending even more time streaming. It's everything is on the schedule on the stream, the Twitch stream schedule. I have it scheduled there. Sometimes things will vary. Like this week, I had frankly some doctor's appointments in the morning, so I didn't get on till like noon instead of 11 on one day. But I'm generally going to try to keep for a few hours a day. And if I'm on and there are a lot of people tuning in and talking and having conversations, I'll stay longer. And like I said, I think I'm probably going to schedule another kind of tavern chat sort of thing for another night. I have been known to occasionally pop on like a Sunday for an hour or two if I'm writing in the afternoon. But definitely drop in. I'd like to talk more about game design and game writing and all that kind of stuff. And I'm glad I talked more as much about broader ideas as I did just about my work. Like I talk about my work a lot during the week. So it was kind of cool just to have other conversations. I like Freed's comment. I didn't expect this to be a philosophical conversation about what's real and what's not. I'm like, oh no, it is. It is because at the core of any spirituality and any religion, that's kind of how I frame everything. But thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks for subscribing. I really appreciate it. So from the Tomes, Twitch TV, from the Tomes, Fox and Board Games on YouTube. foxandboardgames.com is my landing pad, which I'll be updating regularly. I have some cool, exciting news coming soon for everybody. Twitter and Facebook at Fox and Board Games. And thanks for liking, subscribing, following, and watching. I really appreciate it. To everybody who chatted tonight, awesome. Thank you. To everybody who lurked, awesome. Thank you. I'd hope to hear from everyone in the future and have more conversation. Have a good night.